In this video, I'm going to be talking about how much our trip to Croatia and Slovenia cost. The trip was 12 days long. The reason I want to go over this is we get asked a lot how much our trips cost, especially versus other more normal type trips. So on this trip, we went to Croatia and Slovenia, and we actually ended up hitting 6 countries on this trip, which I'll go over throughout the video. But starting off, we will go over what the flights cost. One disclaimer about these costs, there were 5 of us that went, so some of the costs were split by 5, but I will give you the total amount of the cost before I split it up. So the first thing to talk about is flights. Now, we did buy these flights about 6 months in advance, and we did have to go over specific dates. So when going over specific dates, a lot of times it's hard to find a good deal, but luckily we did still find a good deal on these flights. We ended up paying $862 per person. Now, this was a Delta flight flying from Salt Lake City to Graz, Austria, and we had one layover in Amsterdam, which I believe was about 3 hours long. Now, the next thing I want to talk about is travel insurance. We always buy this prior to our trip through Insure My Trip. You can pick through a lot of different options. I usually pick an insurance that covers medical coverage in the country and also some sort of medical evacuation. So if anyone has some sort of medical emergency, we can go to the hospital, we can get out of the country without any problems. I don't typically cover or worry about any delay insurance or anything like that. If you have a credit card, a travel credit card, you're usually covered anyway. But realistically for me, I'm not as worried about losing my luggage as I am worried about having a big medical expense that my normal insurance doesn't cover, so that's why we get travel insurance. That travel insurance for us on this specific trip costs $51 a person, so I'll add that to the tally. Okay, the next big expense on this trip was the rental car. Now, we definitely overpaid for this rental car. I couldn't find a good deal, but the problem was that we were going to be driving a long distance. There were 5 people. We wanted a decent amount of space, and we didn't want to have a tiny European car that wouldn't fit our bags, wouldn't fit the people, and would be super uncomfortable for driving long distances. So we ended up getting a Mercedes Vito van, which is like a mini Sprinter van. It was bigger than I wanted, but it did fit us all really nicely. It ended up costing us $1,365. Now that was split between 5 people. One person was paying $273 for a 12-day rental. Now this did include the fact that we picked up the car in Austria and we ended up driving it through Croatia and Slovenia. They charged us an extra $235 to be able to drive into Croatia and Slovenia because we were out of Austria for most of the days. If I were to redo this trip, I would probably pick up the car in Slovenia or Croatia just because we wouldn't have to pay that fee. Okay, now getting into lodging. We split our stay into several different hotels. Our first stop was in Maribor, Slovenia, and we stayed 3 nights. We stayed in Hotel Maribor, which was right in the downtown center of Maribor, and that cost us $543 for 3 nights. My portion of that hotel was $271.50. Now this hotel was like a large Airbnb, had a kitchen and everything, so it was a little bit above average. Our next stop was in Dubrovnik, and we stayed in Hotel Liro for 5 nights. My split of that hotel was $207. Next, we stayed in Bled for 2 nights at the Garni Burke Hotel. It had more of a bed and breakfast feel. I love staying there, and my split for those 2 nights was $137. Lastly, we stayed in the Amsterdam airport for 1 night because on the way home, we ended up having about an 18-hour layover in Amsterdam. So we stayed the night and got to enjoy downtown Amsterdam. That hotel cost me $76.46 for my portion. The next portion of costs is the gas, the tolls, parking, and other travel expense. We parked our car at the airport on this trip, and that cost me $109.20. In Slovenia, we needed a vignette to be able to drive on the freeway, and that cost me $40.16. In Croatia, when you drive on the freeway, you have to stop and pay tolls every so often. Basically, when you get on the freeway, it tracks when you get on and when you get off the freeway. So for the Croatia tolls, I ended up paying $18. My total portion of the gas bill was $171. Lastly, in Amsterdam, we took the train to downtown and that cost me $7. The next section is sightseeing. So from Dubrovnik, we took a couple of different day trips. We took a day trip to Montenegro. We did a tour to do this. It just seemed easier at the time, and this cost me $66. We also took a day trip to Mostar, Bosnia, and that cost me $63.63. These day trips were well worth it. It was a lot easier, especially after I'd been driving for so long. It was nice to have somebody else drive me around. The last two things I paid for as far as sightseeing were the Dubrovnik Pass in Dubrovnik, which cost me $58. This included a lot of the sites and museums in Dubrovnik, including the Dubrovnik walls, so I thought this was well worth it. Lastly is some miscellaneous spending and food. So for food, I took cash out and mostly used cash for my food, but I did have some on my credit card. So the credit card meals for me cost me $127.50. And then the cash that I spent was $150. I also ended up having an overweight bag on the way home, which cost me $99. I did not mean for that to happen, and I did not want to pay that, but I ended up putting some other people's stuff in my bag. They went through security, and it sent my bag overweight, so we couldn't redisperse items since they had already gone through security, so I ended up having to pay the $99 for my overweight bag fee. Lastly, I had to pay for dog sitting while we were gone, and that cost me $250. So the total cost for me on this trip was $3,037.45. Now we were able to see some of Austria, Slovenia, Croatia. We were able to take day trips to Bosnia and Montenegro. We drove from Graz to Maribor, to Dubrovnik, to Bled. It was a whirlwind of a trip, but we were able to see that much in 12 days, and it cost us $3,000 each. I think overall we did okay on this trip. We could have done better. The lodging and the car were definitely overpriced for what we could have gotten. Almost $1,000 of that was the flight. So after the flight, I really only spent about $2,100. Let me know what you guys think of the video. I'm planning to do this on our next two trips that are coming up. Let me know if you think this is too expensive for a trip or if it's less than you thought.